So I just got an email from YouTube. Because I am a fantasy booktuber, I am contractually obligated to make this video. Welcome to Malazan Books, where I talk about fantasy, mostly science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. I am not actually contractually obligated to make this video, but everybody does it. And I've been a booktuber for about 6 months, and I thought it's not a bad thing as kind of a record of where I'm at now to do my top 10 fantasy series. I realized when I started putting this list together that I haven't really read that much for a long time. So I tend to go through spurts where I'll have like 3 months where I read a lot, and then I might not read at all for the rest of the year. And then maybe 6 months I might read a bit, and on and off and so on. Starting this channel, of course, has given me a really, really good motivation to read regularly. But I haven't finished that many series, to be honest. So I wanted to kind of fix where I'm at now, because I expect it to change. I'm going to be reading a lot of things in the next couple of years, and I've got a number of really good series, I think, really good series lined up to read. So this list will probably be totally different in a year or two. So let's talk about the rules. My rules for this were maybe a little different than some people's. I decided I am going to include unfinished series because I feel like it. I am only including series that I've read all of, or at least all of what's available. And before you watch till the end and then write me an angry comment, you will not find Kingkiller Chronicles or the Stormlight Archive in this list. Not because I haven't read them, not because I hated them, but Kingkiller was good. Parts of it were really, really good. Parts of it were kind of cringy. It doesn't really make it onto my top 10. Sorry. And Stormlight Archive, I haven't actually read everything that's there. I have read, I think, 3 of the books. I quite liked them. I didn't deeply fall in love with them, but I did quite like them. But I kind of feel like I have to reread those 3 to be able to read everything else that's there. And I may do that eventually, but it's not super high on my priority list. So, starting with number 10, that is the maybe most clumsily named fantasy series of all time. The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. This is one of the ones I expect to maybe slip off of my list. I read it when I was a teenager. I loved it then. I read it again, I think, when I was in my 20s, and still really liked it. I have no idea. I have a lot of pictures in my head still from the book, which is a good sign. It left an impression, but I'm not sure how my now gray beard reading tastes will jive with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. But for now, it's on the list and looking like it may slip off. The story, if you don't know it, is it's a guy in our world who is a leper. Not a metaphorical leper, he's an actual leper. His body is rotting and he has to take extremely good care of himself, and he is ostracized from society. He ends up in another world, a magical world creatively called the Land, where his wedding ring, his white gold wedding ring, gives him immense magical power. And because he's lost 2 fingers and has a white gold ring, he is taken to be a returned legendary hero. And he behaves very badly, and it's a story of him redeeming himself. It's a story of finding a place and a group of people to belong to and find something to believe in and fight for. And it's a really interesting world. It's not super crazy imaginative. It's a bit Tolkien derivative for sure, but I remember really, really loving some elements of it. So I'm interested to reread it and see what I think now. At number 9, we have the Chronicles of Amber. I believe I've mentioned this before. It's a series by Roger Zelazny, who actually wrote my favorite book of last year. And this is very different from Lord of Light, which was my favorite book last year. It's a 10-book series, or more correctly, it's 2 5-book series. But this was written back in a time when a fantasy book was as thick as your finger. It wasn't as thick as your arm. So 10 books of Amber, all 10 of them, are about as thick as the biggest Malazan book. So it's not too much. Certainly one of those books is really, really quick and easy to read. It's a story of a royal family, and specifically the first 5 books deal with Corwin of Amber, who is a prince in the kingdom of Amber. Amber exists at one end of a spectrum of infinite dimensions. At the other end is chaos. And those dimensions are called shadow. And the royal family of Amber has the power to walk through shadow, which basically means that they can travel into all imaginable dimensions just by walking. It's told in first person by Corwin. And then the second series, the second 5 books, is told by Merlin, his son. And certainly the first 5, I remember very vividly. There are a lot of things in it that stuck in my memory. There are a lot of things in it that I discover in later works by other people. So it's a very influential series. I've read it at least twice, maybe 3 times already. And it's definitely one of my favorites. Number 8 is almost embarrassing because I think it's pretty much on every fantasy booktuber's top 10 list. The First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This was maybe the first series I ever read that made me realize that an entire fantasy series could be filled with mostly unlikable asshole characters who none of them you really admire that much, but you still end up liking them anyway. I think up until I had read The First Law, I'd read a whole bunch of more heroic, more typical epic fantasy with good guys and bad guys and heroes who might be a little gray occasionally, but they're mostly white, and bad guys on the other end of the spectrum. And Joe Abercrombie, I think all of his work, but certainly The First Law, which is the only books of his I've read, broke that in my head because I ended up loving Glokta and Logan, and lots of the characters in there are pretty reprehensible and maybe not people you would actually want to have a beer with in real life, but they're very interesting, and I got very involved in the story, and I ended up actually rooting for a lot of these kind of nasty characters. Well done, Mr. Abercrombie. Number 7, and I say this every time I make a list, I think. I'm cheating a little bit. Number 7 is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. It's technically science fiction, but it takes place in a world that feels a lot like a fantasy world. There isn't exactly magic, but it's a dying Earth. It is actually our Earth. In the extremely far future, the sun is dying, and the whole culture and everything has a feeling of winding down and becoming maybe more violent, more or less civilized, and more decadent. And it's a book with so many layers. It's extremely deep. There's so many things going on in it which are maybe difficult to figure out and decipher on your own. It's one of the only fantasy books I know of that has, published by someone else, its own dictionary and its own chapter-by-chapter guide. Because it is quite complicated. I've read it twice already. I think maybe I've understood about 75% of it. Luckily, this year, I will be rereading it with buddy read with Philip Chase. And the two of us together, I think we'll probably figure out more than I was able to on my own. So I'm really looking forward to that. Book of the New Sun. It's actually 4 books. but they all belong together. And then there's another one which is kind of written quite a bit later and also belongs to it, but it's much later in the future of that world. I'm really looking forward to rereading those. Number 6 is a series which I kind of suspect might creep higher in my list if I reread it, because it's been a while. I read all of it. It is not a finished series, but it's The Lies of Loch Lomara. Loch, as I for shorthand call the series, Loch is a very thiefy, heisty kind of series. It's about, the first book certainly is about a group of thieves who've been trained by a master in a church, actually, to be a gang of thieves. That's very, very basically what's going on. Of course, there's a story. There's all sorts of betrayal and twists. There's also one of the best bromances ever in fantasy between Locke and Jean. And it's a 3-book series at the moment. Scott Lynch, the author, has said that he is planning on making it 7 books, but it sounds like he's been having a difficult life for a while, and is taking care of himself and hasn't written anything in a while. There are meant to be some novellas connected to it coming out sometime. The 4th book has a name, but no published date that I know of. I'm looking forward to more. When the 4th book comes out, I will reread the first 3, but they are super books. Number 5. If you saw my best books of 2022, you already know what this is. It's the only series I've ever read that really inspired me to buy a prop, namely this. That's right, it's The Dark Tower by Stephen King. I loved these books. They are so strange. They are completely different than any other kind of fantasy I've ever read, because they are fantasy, they're science fiction, they're horror, they're metafiction. There's a lot of stuff going on in these, but in the end, the biggest theme is really found family. It's finding some people that you really can belong to, who belong to you, and trusting them and doing anything for them. And that is demonstrated over and over and over again throughout this amazing series. There are highs and lows. There are bits of it that are not as good as other bits, but as a cumulative series, it is really, really stunning. I highly recommend everyone read The Dark Tower. Number 4 is one that I would have put higher on my list if my top 3 were not so damn good. It's A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Everybody knows this book. Maybe not everyone's seen the series on television. Maybe not everyone's read the series. But everyone has heard of A Game of Thrones, at least, unless you've been living under a rock forever. I read the first 3 books, I think, 3 times now. I've read the whole series, all of them at least once, and I'm rereading it right now in the A Song of Ice and Fire read-along. It's so well written. It's such a convoluted plot with so many different characters and so many different complex relationships. And they're all done, at least in the first 3 books, they're all done quite masterfully. Everyone loves to harsh on George R.R. for not continuing it. He originally said it would be a trilogy, in which case he would be finished, but he expanded that to 7 books and he's written 5. So we're waiting on more books, George. But even without it being finished, it is such a good read. It doesn't feel like it's unfinished because there are so many different stories going on and there are so many things happening. And there are a number of stories that begin and end already just in those 5 books. Of course, there are some really big things that we're all looking forward to seeing, which haven't happened yet. So we're looking forward to the rest of the books. But even though it's only 5 at the moment, it's super worth, totally worth reading. So we made it to the top 3. Ranking is really hard for me. I don't really like ranking because some books are amazing for plot and other books are amazing for character. And that doesn't make one book better than the other. So just take it that all 3 series in my top 3 are absolutely worth reading and extremely highly recommended by me. Number 3, Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. Realm of the Elderlings can be taken a lot of different ways. It's 16 books, which is the longest series I know of, but it's not exactly a series. It's a trilogy, which is first-person character from one guy, and then it's a trilogy, which is told in a totally different place, in a totally different style, totally different characters, very little overlap. And then there's another trilogy that goes back to the guy from the first trilogy, and so on. It's 4 trilogies and a quartet. So there are a lot of different things you could theoretically pick up in it, but I highly recommend, if you want to read it, that you join the read-along, which I'm doing right now, 1 book a month, starting at the beginning, going to the end. It's going to take all year and 4 months into next year to get all 16 books done. But I'm so happy to be back. I read the first book this month, Assassin's Apprentice, and fell in love all over again, even though I've already read it twice. So Realm of the Elderlings definitely belongs extremely high on my list, maybe higher than it is. I'll be rereading it throughout the year, and it might nudge up towards the top. We'll see. If you had asked me 2 years ago what was my number 1 fantasy series of all time, it would have been this. You can probably already guess what number 1 is, and that's the reason this is number 2. Lord of the Rings has fallen from number 1, which it's been pretty much all of my life. Lord of the Rings is such a classic. There is so much fantasy that was written based on Lord of the Rings, but a little bit different. There is so much Tolkien derivative work out there. He set the idea of fantasy, the way we think of it now, was created by him. There was fantasy stuff before Tolkien, of course, all the way back to ancient mythology, which is basically fantasy. But Tolkien kind of created the box of what we consider modern fantasy as a genre. And it's also just a really good tale. It's a really good tale of friendship and doing the right thing. It's got very clear good and bad defined in it. But it's also got a lot of characters who waver, who are basically good, but then maybe make bad decisions or get a little greedy or see an easy way to get something done, which isn't so good. It's such a classic, and even if you like the movies, I highly recommend that you read the books because they are a different thing. The movies are very good. I love the movies, but the trilogy, plus The Hobbit before it, they are just such excellent books. They're so well written. The characters are so fun and heroic, and it's old school fantasy as it ought to be written. Number 1, unless you are on my channel for the very first time, you probably knew what this was when you saw the thumbnail to my video. That's right, The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. It's a mammoth thing. It's the biggest series I've ever read, and it really is one series, 10 books. There are also side things. There's a prequel trilogy being written. There's a sequel trilogy being written. There are a series of books by another author, Ian C. Elsamont, who is a close friend of Steven Erikson's, and they created this world together. And he's also written a number of novels, a trilogy, and a series of 9, I think, books or 6 books. It's a lot of books. But the main series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I'm currently rereading the 6th book. The whole thing is millions of words, hundreds of thousands of pages. It's amazing, though. It is the deepest and most complex world in fantasy that I know of. It has the largest cast of characters in fantasy that I have ever read. It has 9 or 11, I think 11, sentient races. It has has an amazing magic system, which is not hard Brandon Sanderson kind of magic, but it's really amazing how it's used in the story. And best of all, it's extremely well written, and it's written for adults. Doesn't mean that there are raunchy sex scenes, there aren't, but it's written assuming that you can figure things out, that you can be patient and gather clues and understand things over a period of time reading it. It's written in such a way that the characters, when the character that you're currently with is confused, you'll probably be confused too, which totally makes sense to me. It can be frustrating, but it's also such a rewarding experience when you do figure something important out, or when a character goes somewhere and you suddenly see something that you've been waiting for. It's such a good series. As soon as I finished it, I knew I would reread it. So my #1 series of all time, which may change in the future, is the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So like I said at the beginning, I did this list pretty much to document where I'm at right now, because I know this list will change, and probably already in the next 6 months, definitely in the next year. But I'm really interested to see how it does change. I'm really interested to go back and reread some of the older books on this list, like the Book of the New Sun, which I'll be rereading with Philip Chase soon. What are your favorite fantasy series? Don't feel obliged to put 10 in the comments. You can if you want, but just give me 1 or give me 3. I'd really love to hear, especially if there are things that are not on my list, because I realize there is so much fantasy out there that I have not read yet, and I really look forward to getting into it. Look out in the next few days for the companion video to this, which is series that I need to read or finish. And I hope you're well. Keep reading awesome series, and I'll see you next time.